one other point I wanted to make that took place that was manifested over the past over the last week, and Dave Weigel, writing for the CIA, had a piece that about what's happening in the Democratic Party over the issue of antitrust, or as he calls it, antimonopoly. Now, if you've been listening to this program for the past year and change, maybe I guess now, gosh, year and a half, 2 years, you know that one of the things that we were talking about, and one of the things we were anticipating with the election of Hillary Clinton, was the ascendance of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in the Senate, and the agenda of antitrust or antimonopoly rising. We've had a number of guests since the election.
One was before.
Barry Lynn. Two were actually before. Lena Khan we had in 2014 when these themes were starting to develop. There was an initiative at the, is it New America Foundation?
New America Foundation.
And run by this guy, Barry Lynn, called the Open Markets Initiative. And we had Barry Lynn on in October, the last week of October, in anticipation of this big push by folks within the Democratic Party to push for a return to the antitrust positions that we had during much of the 20th century, which was that large corporations, when they get too large, when they create monopolies, are fundamentally anti-democratic. That not only can they distort prices and services for consumers, but they infringe upon the development of rivals. They infringe upon the freedoms that we have in a society. That they are toxic to a democracy in a multitude of ways. In the late 70s, early 80s, the Chicago School, Chicago University, University of Chicago, School of Thought, led by Robert Bork, pushed that monopolies are only bad and we should exercise antitrust law only as a function of consumer welfare. So in other words, if a huge company can provide cheaper prices than two smaller companies, or three smaller companies, or four smaller companies, or five smaller companies, then we should not restrict it with antitrust laws. With no regard of the power that company will have in terms of public policy, with no regard as to the power that that company has in stifling innovation, with no regard as to that power that company has to stifle competition and the value of competition, and frankly, with only a short-sighted notion of what constitutes consumer welfare. And under Reagan, and subsequent to that, certainly within, as recently as the Obama administration telling its Federal Trade Commission to not worry about Google, Facebook, even Microsoft was left on the table when George Bush came in. The DOJ was looking at Microsoft back then. We have had a diminishing, I guess, and a shrinking notion of what antitrust enforcement should be. And you can go back, you can listen to the Barry Lynn interview that we did in October 25th of 2016. You can search for, if you are, particularly if you're a member and you're on the app, or if you're using our app, you can look for Lena Khan back in 2014. Not directly having to do with antitrust, but basically taking on the issue of Amazon. You can listen to, in June of this year, K. Sabil Rahman, Democracy Against Domination. Similarly, about antitrust and antimonopoly, you can listen to Matt Stoller in July of this past year. And all of this blew out into the open over the week we were off when Barry Lynn was fired and Open Markets was jettisoned from the New America Foundation. Now, look, there's a lot of controversy around this narrative. But broadly speaking, it appears that because New America Foundation got most of its funding, huge amount of its funding, from Eric Schmidt of Google, it created internal tensions over the years. And as open markets and this idea of anti-monopoly became more and more mainstreamed into democratic ideas, in June of last year, 2016, Elizabeth Warren gave a big speech at an open markets conference. So the tension was mounting internally. And there's a lot of dynamics about think tanks that I won't bore you with. But the tension was mounting when Google was fined by the EU by, I think it was $2.6 billion. This happened a couple months ago. Barry Lynn wrote an op-ed congratulating EU regulators. And it appears like this was the final straw. It's unclear how much pressure was there. It's unclear how much pressure you need. If you're a think tank, I mean, look, I got news for you folks. If I'm getting $25 million from, the button-down collar shirt business, it's one thing for Michael to come in dressed like he's, it's Sunday morning. He's just going outside to get the paper on his stoop, wearing his Tony
slippers. Soprano tracksuit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But if he starts articulating that collared shirts are bad,
Yeah, particularly on you.
I'm just in general. I don't need to hear from the guy who's giving me $25 million to support collared shirts. I'm like, hey, dude, I'm going to expect that he's not going to like that, or she, the promoter of collared shirts. And I'm going to be like, you know what? Maybe it's time.
Warren's coming to our next conference. Sorry.
Cut it. Knock it off. And that's the part where you see, the power of these entities. Now, of course, Eric Schmidt doesn't have to give money to New America Foundation and whatnot, but for him, it's like he's got billions because of an outfit like Google. And so new markets, or I should say open markets, spun off. And they have launched a new project and site, Citizens Against Monopoly. And it's interesting. Like I said, Dave Weigel wrote about this and noted the change in the Democratic Party, because this made it part of, the marginally better deal. The best part of that marginally better deal was the adoption of anti-monopoly rhetoric and disposition. We also saw this even in Al Franken's and others' grilling of Gorsuch during the Supreme Court fight. You're quashing the little guy. It's interesting. Anne Marie Slaughter, the head of the New America Foundation, in writing more about what led to Barry Lynn's dismissal, wrote this. Barry's new organization and campaign against Google is the opening salvo. And from her perspective, I think part of what happened here was there was this tension. It became essentially untenable. And Barry Lynn and his group used this tension as a way of moving this issue to the forefront. And she wrote in a Medium post, Barry's new organization campaign against Google is the opening salvo of one group of Democrats versus another group of Democrats in the run-up to the 2020 election. I personally think the country faces far greater challenges of racism, violence, a broken political system, and geographic and partisan divisions so great that we're losing any common sense of what we stand and strive for as a country. Now, it's fascinating. There's a couple of things that's fascinating about this statement to me. All right, put aside whether or not, all the stuff with New America Foundation. What's fascinating about this is the idea that, open markets actually wrote quite a bit about the problems of monopolies and what it does in terms of black and brown-owned businesses. But the idea of a broken political system is both a function of antitrust and antimonopoly and also provides less enforcement. You want to lessen geographic and partisan divisions? Antitrust policy or anti-monopoly policy is a great way to do it. There was some polling done. In April of 2016, Hart Research Associates conducted polling. It surveyed 1,100 voters, 341 from the decisive Rust Belt states, and found just a slim majority saying Democrats favored, quote, average Americans over large corporations and banks. The polling found corporate monopolies viewed negatively by 66% of all voters and 70% of Rust Belt voters. The words corporate monopolies. What's interesting is just 21% of Rust Belt voters, however, favored antitrust laws, which means that that's probably an antiquated phrase. But in other words, if you want to reach across partisan and geographic divides, running against corporate monopolies and actually implementing and executing an agenda against corporate monopolies is a great place to start. So this is something to keep an eye on. And also be clear here. This is not socialist policy. This is well within your mainstream capitalism. It's just we have veered away from that.
Well, we haven't had that kind of mainstream capitalism for decades.
Well,
yes,
true.
It's a question,
but true.
No, but it's absolutely not socialistic. But I just want to highlight. I think, this deployment of, regardless of the specifics, but Anne-Marie Slaughter, and it goes back. When Hillary Clinton said to Bernie in one of those debates, he went on one of his Wall Street rants, and she said, Wall Street won't solve racism. It was breathtakingly disingenuous because of how actually Wall Street abuse does,
regulating Wall Street won't.
Regulating Wall Street will not solve racism, and of course, it's totally disingenuous because Wall Street run amok does disproportionately affect people of color.
But even if it doesn't,
that's exactly. It's an insane. But I'm saying that even the phraseology, like this Democrats that don't want to rein in corporate power are going to, the new ballywick is to disingenuously exploit really important social justice and racial issues. And that's all over that Slaughter statement. It's like, we don't have time to deal with corporate monopolies and inequality because Trump is president, essentially, is what she's saying. And I mean, it's just going to show up everywhere. That's going to be the kind of tactic
the fact
of
the
that
matter
pseudo
is,
woke
while
center.
while Trump is president, we're not going to do anything about
Anything.
monopolies. But we're not going to do anything about anything. The question is, from a rhetorical standpoint, what's going to get you elected? And this would certainly help.
Oh, certainly, but I don't. I mean, clearly
Talking
there's some
about-
cross purposes there with some of these people. Just
Well,
even with look at the funding question.
It is the functional equivalent of Jeff Sessions going up there and saying, the reason why we're rolling back DACA is because of constitutional reasons, as opposed to we're rolling back DACA because we don't want brown people in our country. And when whomever, Anne Marie Slaughter or whomever it is, says, the reason why we don't want to deal with monopolies is because we've got racism, it's also just as disingenuous. I got news for you. You can do both. And not only can you do both, even if they were mutually exclusive, they're not mutually exclusive. So
They're actually synchronized.
But-
yeah.
But this is a growing movement within the Democratic Party, and the reality is that at least in terms of the public's imagination, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have as much power as, well, certainly the Anne Marie Slaughters. I mean, but the question is how much does this catch on amongst Democratic voters, Democrat Party at large. Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos